Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. What is compositing? It's where you take images and combine them to make new images. So effects like this where you're seeing explosions in the background, that's done with compositing. In After Effects, this becomes quite easy if you learn the key skills. So I'll show you how to track footage into place and more importantly how to mask it and blend it in so that you get a real 3D look as though it's genuinely there. We'll look at advanced blending modes and ways of corner pinning so that you can attach 3D objects to backgrounds and make them look as though they were really there, even in difficult footage, which is quite difficult to track. Then we're going to look at more advanced shots where you combine these skills and link layers together to get the final result. We'll also look at how you can make multiple tracking points and link them together so you can create a shot like this where the UFO flies through the city and even flies behind the buildings. We'll also look at adding shadows to 3D footage and creating fog, 3D fog that the camera can actually fly through. Sparks and flashes will be added next, and then my favorite lesson shows how you can take really difficult handheld footage and composite an object into there looking like it's hovering in the background. We'll also look at how you can see through an actor's skin even in 3D so that you can see the bones and muscles underneath. And we'll create an artificial window by adding a reflection when there was no window there in the first place. And we'll look at manual tracking, which is a way of animating manually, which can actually be a shortcut. And when used on advanced projects with multiple Photoshop layers, you can create really complex effects. Finally, we'll look at set extension, where you can create this type of scene even though we started with footage of someone walking down a suburban street. By tracking the elements into place, you can create a truly realistic look, and with the skills you learn, you'll be able to make just about any composite shot that you want. I hope you enjoy the course. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy, and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass, where we're using After Effects to create visual effects. So the easiest shot in the world is to take something like this, just a plain, simple background, and make it look like this. So we have smoke on the far right there and the figure walks across the frame. If you've used After Effects at all, I hardly need to show you how to do that. You would simply place your smoke element into the scene, bit of color correction, and you're done. But it's worth showing you a little more of this music video that I created some years ago, because there are more complex visual effects, such as these here where there are explosions in the background. There you go, behind that mound of earth, but in front of the power station. There they're rising up in the background. And here, this is the sort of shot that people think we spent a fortune on. And then there are more subtle shots like this, where there's just smoke in the foreground. And again here, smoke rising up behind a building. And it's worth having a look at that music video. It's called Dreaming Light by Anathema. It cost just $400 to make. And when people look at it, they think we had tens of thousands, and that's all down to the power of After Effects. This power station clip has been used in several of my tutorials to show you just how versatile After Effects is. This is a good way to get to grips with the basic idea of tracking and placing an element into your scene. This is the basis for all compositing work. Go to Window, Tracker to bring up the tracker tools. Just expand those down here. And then over here we click Track Motion, and we're going to need position and rotation, because if you look, that clip does have some rotation in it. So we check the rotation box down here, and that gives us 2 track points. Now just zoom in, and remember, whenever you're moving these track points, you want to click inside this center box, but try not to get this crosshair in the middle. When you're over the crosshair, your arrow goes white, and if you do that, all you do is move the crosshair. You don't want to do that, so click inside the smaller box and move the box to a point of high contrast. I think I'll try just the edge of that black dot there. And the second point, which is going to measure rotation, should go to another point over at the side. Let's pick that one there. Now when you try to track, if it doesn't work, you can just pick new points. First of all though, let's create Layer New Null Object, and that will become the target down here. Click Edit Target, pick Null 1, and that's where our tracking will be applied. So now we click Analyze Forward, and just watch how well that track works. You can see visually that those track points do stay in place. If they'd suddenly zoomed off to the side, then you could go back in and expand this box or expand this box to try and get a better tracking point. However, we've got a good track there, so we just click apply, and that applies to our null. And if you watch this red box now, you can see that follows the motion of our clip. We can now add footage to this and composite it in with different blending modes. So here we have a smoke element which we can add, and this hasn't been pre-keyed, and by that I mean it doesn't have an alpha channel. Sometimes you can buy footage or create footage and it has an alpha channel built in, and then compositing is as simple as dropping it into place. In this case, we'll drop it into the timeline, and then we're going to need to change its blending mode and move it around a little. First of all, I'll right click, choose blending mode, multiply, and now you can see that smoke in place. Now it's not tracked in yet because we've not attached it to the null. So to do that, I grab the smoke layers parenting lasso here and just drag that line out to the null over here. And now you can see that smoke has the correct rotation and movement. Now you need to make it look good, and that's the real secret of compositing. So we can now position this where we want in the frame, and it'll still be attached to that null. So you can see there I've put it too far over to the right, so we'll just move it back like this. That looks pretty good there. And then once it's in place and you're happy with it, you need to mask out the foreground. So click on the pen tool, make sure the smoke layer is selected, and then click around the edges of the power station like that. I find it easy to click around the object that I'm trying to get rid of, then hit M and check the inverted box. Now when we play through, the smoke appears to be rising up behind the building. You can see there the mask isn't working further into the shot, so I'm just going to reposition this marker over here and down here. We want that smoke to show up behind the building. Okay, let's see if that stays accurate from the beginning. Because of the way that this has been tracked, we're actually going to need to animate the mask. So I'll go to the end of the clip here, click on the mask, and just make sure it's exactly how I want it. I'll hit F and drag up these numbers here just to feather that slightly. Just the smallest amount of feather, we don't really want it to be too feathered. And there, that looks pretty good there. Now hit M again, keyframe the mask path here, then I'll go right back to the beginning of the clip and correct it here and just see if that automates the whole process. So I'll just click on that mask point, move it up, and on this one over here. With that tracked and masked into place, I want to play with the blending modes to see what works best, because at the moment the smoke is mixing with this wire here and it really just looks as though it's in front of the wire rather than behind it. So you can either right click, choose blending mode and keep trying out different modes, or the best way to cycle through them is to hit shift and plus and just keep doing that, testing out the different blending modes till you find one that works. And then when you're happy with it, just right click on it so you can see which it is. It's selected there with a little dot, so we've chosen darken there. And that works quite well because it appears to be behind the wire and yet in front of the sky. But I'm going to want to bring its opacity down. So I'll hit T, drag the opacity down, and that's looking much better already. So the idea is that the smoke should look as though it's there. The viewer shouldn't think this is a visual effect. They should hopefully think that the smoke was actually there. A good way to do this is to duplicate the layer and then just drag it in the timeline to the left so you have a different version playing at that point. And now we've got two lots of smoke rising in the same place. You might need to adjust the mask to accommodate for the fact that you've moved that up, but you can see how that just thickens the smoke and makes it look more realistic. There's still more we can do to this, and in the next lesson I'll show you some ways that we can really improve this and help sell the shot, as well as working with blending modes in a bit more detail. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. And here in After Effects we've composited some smoke into the background. That works fairly well, but I can see a problem down here where that window is showing bright white. I'll just zoom in so you can see that. And really there should be smoke showing through there. Now in the video I showed you before we had a similar situation to this. And the solution was to draw small masks over each window so that you could see the smoke behind the building there, which works, but I'm just thinking there might be a better solution here, because one trick that I often like to do when you put an object behind another is to also put something in front. So by that, what I mean is instead of obsessing about trying to get everything behind the power station building, why don't we put some smoke in front as well? I'll just duplicate this layer, the smoke layer, and then I'm going to hit M to remove the mask, and I barely need to do anything else. That's already doing the job for me. I might just move this down a little like that and across, and if you watch this now you can see that we have some smoke rising up in front of the building and some behind. I might want to make that more subtle. I'll just move this across and down like that, so that we've still got plenty of smoke coming up behind the building here, but some in front. And just having that slight overlap really does help to sell the reality of the shot. It makes the smoke look more three-dimensional, and it just gives that feeling that it really is there. When you obsess about getting everything behind, which is sort of what you're trained to do as a compositor, it can lead to things looking a little unrealistic. So by doing this, we've solved the problem of the window down here, and we've made the whole thing look a lot better. Now, if I wanted to add this streak footage, which shows a sort of missile trail coming in, to imagine we really are in a war zone here, then I'm going to have to work with blending modes a little differently. I'll just drag this in. As before, I'm going to parent it, so I drag the streak parenting lasso to the null, and then I'll just play through, see where that goes. Now I can't see how that looks unless I change the blending mode, so let's change the blending mode to add, and you can see there that doesn't look so great. I'll just reposition it. That's a little better, but I'm still getting this feeling of it just looking like the clouds in the background. I'd prefer it to be dark or black. So I'll just cycle through the blending modes to see what works, and nothing is leaping out at me as being ideal. That's not too bad, we could work with that, but that's not too bad either. But I'm not happy in general. I could try the silhouette loomer, and that gives us an effect like this, which really is quite black, but we lose some of the texture and detail in the clip. So instead, I'll just change the blending mode back to normal, and I'm going to go over to Effects and Presets, type Invert, find the Invert filter, and drag that onto my streak clip. And now we have that black streak with some green tinge to it and all the texture and detail. And now if I hit Shift and plus to cycle through the blending modes, I have a much better selection. Already there we have, that's just multiply, and I like the way that's looking. Of course it's going to all need to be color corrected. We need to color correct the background, the smoke, everything is going to need to be corrected to make this look really good. And again, I recommend you watch the color correction course, but I will show you a quick way of doing that. I've positioned this so that it's barely passing in front of the trees. I could even move it across like that. And this is somehow this is a way that compositors save time. You just put the element in a position where it's not going to cause you any trouble or hassle. But what if the director or the person who's making this says, no, I want it to look as though it's passing behind that tree? Well, the problem is when we position it like that, it doesn't look as though it's passing behind the tree, it looks as though it's passing in front of the tree. Now, you can just try cycling through the blending mode to find something that works better, but let's say you really want this particular blending mode, what do you do? A really simple solution is to draw a soft mask around this. Select the pen tool. I'm just going to draw a very small mask around this area of the tree, and then hit M, choose inverted,
then hit F and drag that feather right up like that. And you can see now that the smoke appears to be very soft around the tree. I'll just reposition that a little. Prefer that look. Now as it comes in, it actually looks as though it's behind the tree, and on it goes. And now we've got our positioning right. We could draw a second mask here to make it appear as though it's going behind the building. And with the pen tool selected, just draw a very simple mask around the edge of the building like that. And for mask 2, we need to choose subtract. As we watch through, that does appear to go behind the building. But here's an interesting point. By having composited that almost perfectly, there is a little shine on the edge of the top of the roof there that's quite white. So rather than compositing perfectly, I should actually draw this mask in to cover that shine. So I'll just grab this here, pull that down, and although that's not technically correct, it looks better. Now, as I've said, we do need to give this an overall color correction. You don't have to color the elements individually, so I would just select all the layers, go to Layer, Pre-Compose, click OK, and then apply any color correction to this layer. That could be as simple as choosing the color balance filter, going in and saying that we'll push the shadow reds up, bring the highlight blues down, perhaps apply hue and saturation, and just drag the saturation down to get that sort of war-torn feel. And now when we play through, you can see that applying a color correction to all the different layers at once really helps to create this feeling of them being in the same shot. So this is compositing at its most simple. You're putting a few layers in, attaching them to a null that's been tracked, and by building on this technique, you'll be able to create every kind of visual effect that you want.
Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. And here I'm going to show you how you can composite a new image onto a computer screen. The technique is called corner pinning, and it can be used to attach any image to any flat surface. So although it's often used to replace screens and the side of a car or to put an image on the side of a truck, it can be used more inventively than that. If you look at this shot here, you can see the cassette jam graffiti was stuck onto this wall. Ignore the person floating in the background for the moment, we'll come to that later. But here you can see that even though that's handheld footage, the graffiti stays in place, and here as well. It's been stuck onto the wall and tracked in very pleasantly. And again in the next shot you can see a huge billboard has been stuck onto the bridge there. This is all done using corner pinning. So I'll show you the basic technique on this screen and then we'll attach some graffiti to a wall. So begin by dropping the mountain lake clip in over this and then just make it invisible down here. Then click on the screen clip, go to track motion, and under track type select perspective corner pin. This gives you 4 tracking points. If we zoom in a little, you can see them better. And you just drag these, as always clicking inside the box, up to the 4 points at the edge of the screen. And because there's good contrast on these points, they should work quite well for tracking. This bottom right one is not quite so clear. You can see as it zooms in automatically there, it's a little indistinct, but it should do. And with that one in place, now we'll click on Analyze Forward, and you can see there a pretty good job was done on all these points. They stay in place, but look at the top left, it drifted off quite early on. So when you have this sort of tracking problem, just go back in, and the simplest way to solve it usually is just to expand these boxes. It does slow things down, but it should help. We'll just click Analyze Forward and just watch this one box. And you can see now that that point in the center is staying on that corner of the screen. And it did go off just here. So to repair this track, what we'll do is at this point, I'm going to zoom right in. I can see it's still correct there. So then I'll just click Analyze one frame forward, and that's still working. Then here it's gone wrong. So I'll just reset it myself. I'll open the boxes up
and then just drag that back into place. Now part of the problem is it's trying to look off the screen up here with this box, and it doesn't want that. So I want to keep the box large, but I can't stretch it out above the top of the screen here. So I'll just make it quite wide. Now I'll analyze forward again. And what can happen is as you analyze forward, it fails because it's trying to look outside the screen. So I'll just go back one frame using the previous frame marker rather than analyze backwards. I'll reposition this. I'll keep this inner box quite small and make the outer box large. That should help. Now we analyze forward and it's doing a better job of tracking that. There we go. That's going to work all the way to the end now. But you can see the problem here is that if you were to apply this to a clip where part of the image goes out of the frame, it's not going to work. So there are limitations to this. It will work for certain clips, but not others. In others you'll need to use Mocha AE, and we'll come to that later. So for now, click Apply, make the mountain lake clip visible again, and you'll see that's in place almost perfectly from the outset. It's not a perfect track because if you look at the top, there's some lens distortion that's causing the screen to bend. So where the footage doesn't bend, you get an error at the top here. There are several ways of dealing with that. We could use distortion filters and so on. I'll just hit S to select scale and click the constrain proportions icon there. And then I'm just going to expand the scale up ever so slightly to 103, and that covers that error. And we don't need to change blending modes, that works fine as it is. You could add another layer to this of reflections, but the truth is when you're filming, you're always trying to get reflections off a screen. This is the look that a cinematographer would work very hard to get. So if you can get this artificially, you may as well keep it. Now we use the same technique on the distant wall clip, and instead of pinning something to a perfect screen, we'll put the graffiti on this wall. So the BAM PSD gets dropped in, made invisible, and we click back on the distant wall clip, track motion. Once again we select perspective corner pin. So I'll just go down here, try that one there. Always looking for areas of high contrast that reflect roughly the shape you're trying to recreate. Okay, this isn't a perfect rectangle, but we'll track it, see how the tracking goes, and then we'll think again. Okay, I noticed there that track point 4 jiggled about. I'll try and cure that just by expanding the boxes, see if that works. Track through again from there. That worked. So we now have a good track all the way through. You can see just by looking at that white box, the rectangle inside the frame, that stays attached where it should. So now we hit apply, make the BAM layer visible, and you can see that's already in place. That's working very well. All I have to do is click on the layer, hit A, and use the anchor points here to move this. Of course, if I wanted to use this wall, I would have needed to track something on this wall. It could have been this object up here, the thing on the roof, that would have done. So long as you have something on the same plane, it will work. So I'm going to position this up in the corner. And now we need to work with blending modes and opacity. As before, I'm going to hit Shift and plus and cycle through the blending modes to see what looks best. So that doesn't look too bad, it might be too bright and glowy. I think that's my favorite so far, that's screen. Sometimes to get things to blend, you're tempted to hit T, get the opacity and drag it down. It does help things to blend, but it's not always realistic because if you can see the bricks through that, that's not how the graffiti would really look. You might be able to get just a little hint of their texture, but not too much. So I'll perhaps just pull the opacity down ever so slightly. A better solution is to color correct it to match the background. So I'm just going to put the hue saturation filter on and just bring the saturation down, and that allows some of the color from the background to blend through, and now that's a much better composite. Whenever you've put these layers in, it's a good idea to click the motion blur box here and then make motion blur visible up there, and that means that as the image moves around in the frame, it gets the same level of motion blur as the background. Of Of course, this is the sort of shot where no one should notice it's a visual effect. You're putting things in the background. If we wanted to make this look like a gang-ridden area that was covered in graffiti, we could do that. And ideally, you'd have something in the foreground that people are actually watching. The visual effect should be in the background and not really noticed. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy, and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. Let's imagine we wanted to attach some graffiti to this grey wall here. Now, you might think we could do this using corner pinning as we have done before, but the problem is it goes out of the shot. So if we were to try that, and I'll show you what happens, we position our 4 points, and one thing you'll notice here is that because this is a grey mottled wall, it's quite difficult to find good contrasted areas. This one on the top right would be fine. It might be a little more difficult down here. I'll probably even try to use some of the greenery down here. But let's try that. We track forward, and even though that's working quite well there, it's drifting off on the right. I could try and correct that, but the main problem is it goes out of view, so there's nothing left to track. One solution would be to use the 3D camera tracker. This is often a good solution if you have a shot where the camera's moving through the scene. But when you pan, you'll notice when I try and select any of these points, we get this message that says no depth from a tripod pan solve. And that means that although we have lots of tracking points, they don't give us any sense of depth. So we're not going to be able to use them to composite an image into this. If you've never used the camera tracker, don't worry about that. I'm just illustrating the fact that it's not going to work here anyway. Instead, we're going to use Mocha AE. So I'll just bring the BAM graffiti in to begin with. Then I'll select the crossroads layer and go to Animation, Track in Mocha AE. That will launch in the background. You can see it here. Just click OK, and the interface will open. If you've never used Mocha before, it looks really overwhelming, but it's very easy to use if you just stick to the basics. So up here, you have a Create X-Spline layer tool. Just click that. And then this is just like using the pen tool to select something in After Effects. We'll just select this wall roughly. So I'll click up there, over here, down to here, across to here. When I'm happy, I right click and it's finished. And we'll leave it as simple as that. There are other things you could do, working with these handles to adjust exactly what area is selected, but the idea really is you're just selecting a plane in space. So this is a flat plane and we've surrounded it, and now we can track it. So go down to this button here with the little T to track forwards. Make sure you don't use the play forwards, which is in the center. It's got to be the one with the T. And as you click that, you can see that it follows that plane very accurately. And most importantly, even as it goes off screen, it continues to track its shape. So the left-hand part of the image has gone off screen, but the shape is still holding right up to here. And it's going to stop around about now. It goes wrong, but that's okay. And it stopped saying one or more selections were not tracked properly. Really doesn't matter because we got a good track up to the point where it vanished. And that's all we need. Just click this to go to the in point. Right click on Layer and choose Align Selected Surfaces. Then go down to Export Tracking Data here. And if you select this drop down, there are 3. There is After Effects Corner Pin, and this is Corner Pin only. Then there's one that supports motion blur, and then there's the Transform Data. Select the middle one, so that's After Effects Corner Pin supports motion blur. Then click Copy to Clipboard, and you're done. Go back to After Effects, select your BAM PSD layer or whatever image you're using, and then just go to Edit and Paste. And now if I play through, you can see that is tracked in. It's obviously not in the right place in the frame yet, but it's tracked in to the correct movement. It goes wrong once the wall is out of frame, but that's okay, we won't need it there. If you hit S, you'll see that there are lots of keyframes for the scale, which we're not going to need. You have to be cautious here. If you just click the word scale and select all those keyframes and then delete them, you'll actually delete all the transform data. So instead, go to this triangle here, click it once, then click it again, and then you'll see position, scale, and rotation. And you just make sure that you've only got scale selected. The keyframes will be yellow, then hit delete. Now you can actually change that scale by dragging on these numbers here. That shrinks it down to about the size we want. Now using the anchor point, you can move that into position where you want it to be. That's roughly where we want it. Now if I play through, you can see that stays in the right place right until it's out of sight. However, you'll notice that it's aligned a little too much towards the camera. It's not on the same angle away from the camera that the wall is, so we need to make it 3D. Click the 3D box here, then select the rotation tool, and you can just make out the green, red and blue arrows here. Hover over the green arrow until the little Y appears, click, and then you can just drag to the right and that rotates it the way you want. You could work with the Z as well if you wanted to change the angle that way, but let's just say we're doing it like this. I'm now going to use the anchor points again to reposition that, and now when I play through you can see that seems aligned all the way through. I'm going to change the blending mode to something that suits this particular image a little better. I quite like that look. It looks faded and we can see the wall through it. And you could drag in more images now. All you would have to do is drag them in and parent them, as we've shown before, to this layer, and you could set up graffiti all over this wall. If you wanted to use this wall over here, you would need to track this plane separately. But you could go through this entire shot and you could put graffiti on the floor, on the walls over here, absolutely anywhere you wanted. And of course it doesn't have to be graffiti, it could be whatever imagery you're trying to create for your particular scene. And if you recognize this crossroads, it was used in a famous scene in Twin Peaks Fire Walk with Me. I thought it would be interesting to use something from a real feature film. Of course there was no graffiti in that feature film, but we've added our own. Just to finish off, I'd like to try a different blending mode. I'm going to go back to normal and just pull the opacity down, see how that works. I quite like that. Once again, I think I'll try dragging the saturation down a little. Just helps it blend in. And of course I'll turn on motion blur, and then you're ready to render.
Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. You'll remember I showed you this footage where I have people floating up through handheld shots. I'm going to show you how we can replicate that, but I'm also going to add some graffiti to this shot and show you how we can use the initial tracking from the graffiti to fix the other layer in place. I'm also going to show you a more advanced way of using Mocha AE to track into something like this, and some masking that makes it all work. So I'll click on the wall and sky layer, go to animation, track in Mocha AE. And rather than drawing a track around the area that I want, I'm going to draw a larger track. So again, click on the pen tool here, and eventually I'm going to come down and select this area down here behind the wall. But before that, I'm going to select a wider area. So I'm just clicking around here. The idea of this is to select an area that's easy to track, a big wide area, and then we attach the second track to this. So I'll right click to complete that, then click track forward here. So you can see this is quite easy for Mocha to follow. If I'd just gone in and tracked this red wall, it wouldn't have worked. I know, because I've tried it several times, and no matter how carefully I position the markers, it just doesn't get a good track. So when that happens, it's better to come out and get a big wide area like this, and then we track again. And because you've already tracked it once, you can then go in and be much more refined, and you'll get a really strong result. There you can see that the shape is holding even as it goes off screen, which is of course the power of Mocha. That's why we use it. We couldn't use the normal After Effects tracking here because this is a wall that goes out of the frame. Okay, at that point it finishes. I'll now go back to the beginning, and now I'll draw a second mask inside here. So once again I select the same tool, then I come down here and I draw an accurate mask on the plane of wall that I want to appear. Some people would say get as much of the wall as you can, including these leaves. Others would suggest that you just cover this area here. I find in a shot like this, because the leaves aren't moving, it's best to select the whole area, but you can experiment and see what works best for you. So I'll click that, then right click. Now before I track, I must go over here and change link to track to layer 1. Now I go to track forward. And all the information that we already created by making that first track is helping to inform the second track.
So it takes a little longer because it's using two lots of information, but you can see how precisely Mocha is gathering the information for that wall at the back. That line is staying absolutely along the top of the wall, the line down the bottom and the one down by the side, they're all absolutely perfect. If you'd gone straight in, that just wouldn't have happened. And we're approaching the end of the track now, the plane's moving out of view, and around here, there, that's good. I'll right click on layer 2 and select Align Selected Surfaces. Now go to Export Tracking Data, choose After Effects Corner Pin Supports Motion Blur, copy to clipboard, then go back to After Effects. Once I'm in here, I make the BAM PSD visible again, then go to Edit and Paste. As before, I'll shrink this down, so I'll bring up the scale. So I just click off, make sure I've selected just the scale, delete all the scale points, and then drag on the scale numbers to shrink this down to something that looks about right. Then I'll use the anchor points to reposition. And as before, that's not looking quite in line with that wall, so I'll hit the 3D box, hover over the Y arrow, and move that in. So I'll click here with the pen tool, and I draw a mask fairly accurately, but you'll notice when I complete the mask that it isn't accurate at all in terms of what's showing up on the screen, and that's because I'm drawing the mask in 2D whereas the layer is floating in 3D. So this requires a little bit of work. Hit V to bring up the selection tool. I'll just select this point down here, and you can see as I pull that down, the image itself here is changing. So you need to look at the image and not the mask line that you're drawing. Same up here. Rather than looking at the blue line, I look at the actual image. I now want to cut off this area here, so I'll probably go to the Pen Add Vertex tool, put in another vertex there, drag that across this way, and then move this one up. You can see now that's in line with the wall, but not in the right place. I'll just click the line itself and drag that down. There, that's looking accurate now. I'm not going to change the blending mode just now. I'm going to lock the mask into place. So hit M, keyframe the mask path, then move forward a second, see if the mask needs changing. I don't think it does at that point, but I'll just keyframe the mask again in case. At the 2-second point, it definitely needs moving out. I'll just click this line here and move that out. And then down here as well, you can see a gap has appeared, so I'll click this line and move it down. And then, as always with masking, you go backwards and check to see that it's working. Move forward another second, and of course we need to adjust the mask again. Moving the line itself doesn't do the job there. I need to click off and then click this top point, move it across, click the bottom point, move it to the right, and that's just about right now. Might just edge that line out a little. There we go. And of course go back and check that that's working all the way through the shot. So it's a different way of masking, but it's not too tricky. It just takes a few attempts to get used to it. As before, I'll apply the hue saturation, drag the saturation down, and I'll leave the blending mode at normal. Switch on blurring, and that's ready. Now let's imagine that I want the man to appear up behind this building here. Let's just drop the rising clip into place. This hasn't been pre-keyed, so you'll need to use a keyer on it. I'll use the Luma key in the hope that this is a simple solution. Just turn the threshold up to 5, feather the edges a little, and that looks fine. I'll scale it down, hit S, drag the scale down, that's about right. I sort of want him to emerge here. Click the parent lasso and attach it to the BAM PSD. Now if I go back, you can see that he's already tracked into place now. We don't need to do anything else and he's going to be in the right position. All I need to do is hit A and I can reposition him exactly where I want using the anchor settings down here. I want him to emerge after a while, so perhaps a little further over to the left. Position him there. Move him right down. Now of course at this point he's moving in front of the building, which we don't want. But I'll click the anchor point, keyframe it there. Now I'll go to the end of the composition and use the anchor tools again to position him where I want him in the frame. So we'll say quite high, like that. So if I watch this through now, just pretend he's coming from behind the building for now. We'll sort that out with masking, and that looks pretty good. However, we do need to mask him out. So let's look at where he's first appearing, around here. We'll zoom in on that. So I'll select the pen tool, then just draw a mask along the edge of the building like this. Now we can just see his arm emerging there. I'll keyframe that into place. Now if we go back a few frames, you can see that that mask is still nicely placed on the edge there, so that as he rises up, his arm's moving into place. A little further on though, the mask needs to move down. So I'll move forward a few frames, then just click on these mask points, drag them back down to the wall. As always, move backwards a little. That looks quite good. Move forwards again. And if you're really confident, you can move forward to the 3-second mark, reposition your mask, and just give that a try, see how well it works. You might have got the whole job done with just a few clicks. Usually that won't be the case, but let's go back to the 2-second mark and play through. That's looking good all the way. So it was worth just going forwards and sorting that out. Of course, I do need to expand the mask upwards so that we're not chopping his arm off there. And in fact, I may as well just take that right out, so that as he rises through the rest of the frame, we're not catching him. If I go to the end, yeah, that works. Now he looks very stuck on at this point, but if I just switch on the motion blur here, you can see that that already looks much more realistic. And as he emerges, that looks as real as if somebody really were floating up into space. So even on scenes where you've got a really difficult piece to track, you can achieve that by using Mocha and doing 2 levels of tracking. And then if you have other things to come into the frame, all you have to do is parent them. And then when you draw the mask, it's much easier. You can draw it directly, unlike the one that came from Mocha, which has to be done with that slight offset mask. You'll find that as you go, you're using more and more advanced shots like this. It becomes very quick and easy, so it's worth experimenting. Hello, this is Christopher Kenworthy, and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. I'm going to show you how to track when the tracking points move off the screen. So if you look here, there's a good tracking point right there, a white dot on top of that building. It's quite difficult to find a good tracking point in this shot because it's quite low in contrast and everything looks very similar, but that white dot will serve as well. But as we get towards the end of the clip, you keep following that white dot and it goes out of the frame. Now you've seen before one way to track when things go out of the frame is to use Mocha AE, but it can be quite difficult to get the tracking data out of Mocha in a pure form when you're just trying to move one layer. It's much better for attaching one plane to another plane. So if you just want to track a point, there is a simpler way. This can be useful in shots like this, which I made a few years ago. You can see here, there's meant to be a UFO in this shot. This was for a government project where I was simulating UFO hoaxes. And you can see there, although the camera's moving, the UFO appears to be in the sky, then it disappears. And in a shot like this, the tracking points that you pick for the start of the shot don't usually apply by the end of the shot. So we'll simulate that shot here with this Seattle skyline and this UFO. So start as you always would by selecting the layer and clicking Track Motion. And we'll just use the one tracking point over this white dot. There you go. I'll make that quite large because this is low contrast, and then we'll set that through tracking. And this will be quite slow. It is worth stopping every now and then when it's such a difficult track and zooming in and just checking that it's staying in the same place. So there our crosshair is up on the top left of the white dot. Let's just play through a little further, and it's staying in that position. But when you zoom in like this, you can just check to see if it's drifting out of there, and if it is, there you see I'm finding that's going just a little off. I'll just adjust it manually, move it in ever so slightly, and these manual adjustments just help to make a perfect track.
Because this takes a little while, I'll just jump forward in time. Okay, it's a couple of minutes later now, but I'm going to just pull out, and you can see that tracking point isn't at the edge of the screen yet, but there are plenty of other tracking points appearing over here that I could use. So I'll stop this track now and create another, and then the idea is that we'll connect all this tracking data together. So I'll create my first null object, edit my target, then click apply. And if I just hit U, you can see the tracking data down here has all been passed on to that null. Without moving the current time indicator, I'll click on the Seattle layer again and go to track motion one more time. I'll create a new null for this. This one's called null 2, and I'll set my target now. And then I begin tracking once I find a good tracking point. So I'll head over to the left here, see what's come into shot that might work. Maybe that blob on the edge of the building there. We'll try that. So I click apply forward, and that's tracking much faster than before because it's a better tracking point. This may or may not go all the way to the end of the clip. It's possible that that Ferris wheel will get in the way. If so, we'll just add another null. Looks as though we'll get right to the end of the clip now. So we have two sets of tracking data. I'll just apply that. And again, you can see there, the first set of tracking data goes up to here, and the second takes over here. All we need to do to connect them is parent the second null to the first. So I just click on the parenting lasso here and drag that down to null 1. Now we'll drag our UFO TIFF in, and I'll just grab the parenting lasso and drag that to the second null. If you'd had to track more points, say you'd done 3, 4 or even 5 nulls, you just drag it to the very last one in your chain. And now when you play through, you can see that hovers in place. So even when it gets to this point where the data changes from one null to the other, it stays in place where it's meant to be. I don't want to create a hovering UFO in one place. I want to have this fly across the screen. So first of all, I'll hit S and scale it down. Then hit A and use the anchor points to move it where I want it to be. So I think we want it to be far off the screen to the right. So I'll probably type in -2000 over here. See where that just takes us off screen over here. Keyframe the anchor point. Then I'll go towards the end of the clip and I'll put in 4000. That brings it to there. I think I probably want it to shoot off screen on the right, so I'll drag that up a little higher. It's probably going to be nearer 6000. There we go. So now when we play through, you can see that that tracks across the screen and it's following the motion of the camera very effectively, even though we've had to use two separate tracking points. So by using two nulls, we've tracked that in quite effectively, but I don't really like the speed that that's going across the screen. I'm just going to drag these anchor points closer together, and that way it's going to shoot across the screen part way through the shot. That's possibly too fast, so I'll pull this first one back to about here. And now it looks as though we were just shooting something and the UFO happened to come across the screen. With the blurring visibility switched on, that looks really quite realistic. However, another little trick that's worth knowing is that you can push this into the background behind the buildings just by using some keying. So I'm going to duplicate the Seattle layer, move it to the top in the timeline, and solo it. Then I'm going to go to Luma key, drag that onto the clip, choose key out brighter, and then turn the threshold up until just the buildings appear, but not the sky. I could do a little bit of edge thinning and edge feathering. I don't think we need to be too precious here. Now I'll turn off the solo, and we should see our UFO now fly in behind the buildings. It should fly between the gaps in the buildings. There it goes. You just saw it appear there. That's a pretty impressive
composite, given that all we've had to do is key out some of the brighter parts of the scene. This isn't an ultra realistic shot, that's a very big UFO, but it still blends in quite well. I would be tempted to lighten this a little. I'd do that with the levels filter. I'd grab the center triangle and drag that to the left. That just lightens it, helps it blend in. The main technique that you need to learn from this lesson though is this idea of attaching nulls. And remember that if you added a third null, you would parent the third null to the second. If you add a fourth null, you'd parent the fourth null to the third. So you just make a stack of nulls, and then whatever object you're tracking in, you attach it to the final null, and all your tracking data matches up. There are many After Effects users that don't know this technique, but it's an extremely powerful way of tracking quickly, simply, even in a shot where your tracking points are moving right out of the frame. Hello, this is Christopher Kenworthy, and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. I'm going to show you a way to track a 2D layer into this scene as though it were a 3D object and have it cast shadows. So we'll bring this skeleton image in and composite that somewhere where it's quite visible. Over here it's not very visible, so we'll probably pull it over here somewhere and have it cast a shadow in the same direction as these shadows coming off the trees to the left. Now, first of all, we need to track the camera, so I'm going to select the bridge road layer down here, then go to track camera. As soon as I do that, I want to unfill the advanced triangle here and then click on detailed analysis. It'll then start analyzing it all over again, but you really do need a detailed analysis, because if you run this without the detailed analysis, it'll go for all the detail that's up here in the background in the trees, and you'll get a reasonable track of all that, but you won't get any of the data in the foreground. It sort of chooses the easiest option. If you tell it to do a detailed analysis, it looks at the whole image. So if you have the time, it's worth doing that. This does take, on this computer, about 4 minutes, so I'll just let that time pass and then come back. That's finished analyzing now, and you can see the colored markers showing the tracking points. I like to make these a little larger, so go to track point size, just drag that up. There's no reason not to make them really huge so you can see what's going on. And you can move through the shot and see just what's being tracked where. You hover over these until you find one of these targets that looks as though it's in line with the plane that you want to track onto. So we want something that aligns up with the flat of the road here. So it might be that one, or you could still pick something over here. See, that one there is still capturing the general flatness that we're looking for in this scene. I think I will go with this one on the road though. So I'll right click, and you can create a shadow catcher, camera and light. That is one way to add shadows to a scene like this, but I actually prefer to create a solid and use that. So we've created a solid and a camera down here, you can see them, and we need to make that solid much larger and change its color. So I'll hit S for scale and then scale that up, and if we play through you can see that sort of matches the road and the ground to the side there. Now I'm going to go to Layer, Solid Settings, click on the color box here and change this to white, click OK. That's going to help us transfer the shadows onto the background. I'll just make that solid invisible for now. So I'm going to select here, just right click and create a null, and you can see we have track null 1 here. Now the order that you do things now is very important. Don't make the skeleton 3D yet. Instead, get the parenting lasso and drag that up to the track null 1, then make the skeleton 3D. And you can see how it's flattened down. If you look closely, our skeleton's a tiny little layer down here attached to that null. And you can see that's moving perfectly in 3D space. Of course we can't see it, so we need to make some adjustments. So I'll open up the skeleton's transform properties, and first of all we'll just scale it up. So there, it's looking quite large. I'm going to select the rotation tool and just hover over the red X and rotate like that. And you can see we're in a much better position than we were before. Now I'm just going to hit V for the selection tool, drag that up on the Y-axis Just play through, see if that looks like it's in the right place. It does, that's working very well. Now let's imagine we want it over here where there's a little gap in the shadows at the edge of the road. There are several ways to move it. I could just position it like that, but because it's in 3D space, you'll notice that as I move it over, it starts going sideways. So instead, we'll move it in 3D space. So I'll hover over the X like that and drag to the right. Then hover over the Z and push it backwards by dragging to the left. By moving around in 3D space like this, you can get it exactly where you want it. Even there, I'm finding it's going a little bit sideways on, so I'll hit W to get the rotation tool, hover over the Y, just rotate that to face the camera. There we go. And of course, if I put it in place and then don't like the scale or the size of it, I can just scale it up. So I hit S and just drag that scale up. And I'll move it back a little more. So I think standing there at the side of the road looks quite good. We'll play that through, just make sure that's looking right. So that's captured the 3D data perfectly. It really does look like it's standing there in the scene. All we need to do now is give it a shadow. Let's make our track solid visible again. So hit the track solid, then hit A for the anchor points, and then on this right hand number here, just drag that down to the left until it's just below the feet like that. Now if you play through, you can see it's still following the plane of the ground, it's just been moved down below the skeleton. We hit AA, and under the material options, turn accept shadows to only, and it vanishes so that it will only accept shadows. Go to layer, new, light. That's a point light that casts shadows. Hit OK. And now we need to make our skeleton cast shadows. So we select the skeleton, hit AA, and under cast shadows we turn that to on and accept light to off. Now we need to move our light so that the shadows are landing where we expect them to be. If you don't immediately see the shadows, it's worth going back to your track solid, hitting AA and changing accept shadows to on. And that way you can work with the light in 3D space and see it landing on this white plane. So I can see our light is here. If I just hover over the Y, I can move that up, and over the X I can move it across, and now the shadow is appearing behind the skeleton down here. So I get some idea of how I can move this light around to create a shadow. Clearly, to make a shadow go from left to right, I'm going to need to move this light across the screen to the left. So I'll do that. You may need to zoom out quite a long way to do that. And of course, moving it up will help as well. I'll zoom back in to see what's happening there. Now the shadow direction isn't quite right there, but it's not a bad start, so I'm going to work with that for now. I'll go back to the track solid and change accept shadows to only. So now we see that shadow layer in place. Select the light, hit AA, and change the shadow diffusion. I'm going to turn that right up, and you can see that the shadow starts to blur in the background, because we want a nice blurry shadow like the ones that are already in the scene. I'm going to go to two views, horizontal, and I can see my light over here. Of course, you can adjust the light's transform settings down here and move its position that way just by dragging on the numbers, which in fact can be a very good way to just make these final adjustments. I'm just dragging to the left here and bringing that shadow around in the right direction. And because it's taking time to render, I might just pull this down to quarter resolution, go back to one view, and just play with these numbers until I get the shadow lying exactly where I want it. So after a little experimentation, you should get what you want. I'll turn that back to full. Of course, it's too dark and possibly the wrong color because the shadows here are quite blue. So I'm going to select our track solid, hit T, and just drag the opacity down to about 50. That's much more in keeping with the other shadows that are there. And in fact, its color now has blended quite nicely with the background, and I'm not going to bother with any color correction there. That looks fine. And of course, when the car goes past, you can see that it's going to pass through that shadow
and the shadow is in fact going to lie across the car itself, so you'd need to mask the shadow out there. But this shot essentially works now. We have our skeleton in place. I would probably do a little work on this to make it blend in better. In fact, I would probably darken the skeleton itself and make it more of a shadowy outline. It's just looking too grey and dull there and doesn't really stand out. So I'd probably apply the levels filter to this and just drag the gamma across like that and make it more of a silhouette. That's a better shot already. But the main technique you're learning here is to add a shadow plane so that any 3D object you put in can cast a shadow onto the plane of your ground. You can do this with text or any object that has an alpha channel. This could be a rendered animation and you would still get a perfect shadow matching across the ground. If when you play back you find that your object moves and wobbles in the scene, it means that you've probably used a null that isn't quite as secure as you wanted it to be. It doesn't matter, you can just go into the camera tracker, select a new null. Let's do this right now. Say create null, and we have another track null here. Then all we have to do is drag our skeleton's parenting lasso to that track null and you will get a better result. Hello, this is Christopher Kenworthy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. Now, as a compositor, you're often asked to add smoke and dust and mist or fog to a scene. It's something that's really common and it's very easy to do with the techniques you've already learned. You can just add layers of mist and dust by tracking them in. But I just want to show you a way of really making that a little more interesting than usual. Often people just put flat layers of fog in and it's okay, it adds to the atmosphere, but it doesn't really give you that feeling of passing through fog. If you look at this shot here, you can see the boat is moving forward at a slow rate, so if there was mist over the water here, we would be moving through it. In most cases you won't add mist to a shot that's as bright and sunny as this, but this will still give you an idea of how well this can work. So we'll create a new null object and then we'll track our island water here. And we only need one tracking point. We don't need to do this in 3D because we'll create the 3D effect artificially. So I'll just find something nice and contrasty there and track that. You can try tracking a shot like this with the camera tracker, but it does find it very difficult to pick up the 3D from a scene like this. The hill in the background is almost a 2D layer, and the foreground on the left is no use to us because it's not moving, there's no change of depth. The only information it can attempt to pick up is from the water, and because that's rippling and moving, it doesn't really work. So the best solution is to just track one point in the background and use that. And then, by angling the layers of fog and moving them towards the camera in 3D, you create the effect of passing through that fog. So long as they're attached to one point in the frame, you'll get the illusion you need. So we'll apply that to the null, new solid. I'll make this 3D, and I'll parent it to that null. Then I'll just select the rotation tool and just drag on this so that it's rotated out like that, so we can just watch it. As we move through, you can see that's now quite pleasantly attached to the background. So we'll add some fractal noise to this. Under transform, find the scale and just boost that up, and that gives you a more foggy look. Now we'll draw a mask on it with the pen tool. Just a very rough mask here. Hit F and drag the feather up. Hit V, and I'm just going to reposition this out here. Now the main idea is to have this at an angle away from the camera. So rather than having it flat like that and drawing it to the camera, you get it at an angle like this, and then it really feels like you're passing through the fog. So I'll hit S and scale it up a little. It's quite good. If you don't want it to come over the foreground, you can just pull the mask in like that. That's probably a good idea at this point. And of course we will add other layers of fog, so you don't have to worry about it covering the area up at the top of the screen here. So now I'll hit P to lock the position into place down here. Then I'll go to the end of the composition
And at this point I want the fog to have moved towards us. So it's a combination of movements here that'll bring it towards the camera. So I pull on the Z-axis there, that makes it come forward, but then we need to pull down on the Y to bring it closer to us. And I'll keep combining those movements, maybe a little on the X there. And you can see now it feels as though we've moved through and towards that fog. So now if I go back to the beginning, that plane of fog moves towards us at an angle. Doesn't look very good yet, but we'll change the blending mode. Right click and change that to screen. And now you can see, you get that feeling of actually passing through a 3D sheet of fog. It's a surprisingly strong effect given that that is just a 2D layer tilted at an angle across the screen. As soon as I've done this, I just like to duplicate the layer, hit P to bring up its position keyframes and delete that last one. And that means you can then just move this up to create a second layer which covers any empty space up here that you want to fill. Then go to the evolution settings and just drag this round. It means you've got a different looking fog there. And then go to the end and again just pull that towards the camera. I'm not even going to pull that one down, I'll just let that rise up, and that might actually help with the look of parallax, as some of the fog's going up above the boat and some's passing down towards the bottom right. This is as strong an effect as you'd ever want. It's probably better more subtle, so you might want to hit T and just draw the opacity down, and then you've got just this hint of mist that you're passing through, and that's very realistic even for this sort of sunny weather. If you were to use the sky replacement course and change that background, the blue sky, put in a dark wintry sky, you could then put really thick fog on here, color correct it all, and make it look like a dark foggy day. One last thing I like to do is add an overall sense of fog, so there's even some in front of the boat here. So I'll just create one more solid, and to that I add fractal clouds. And I change the blending mode to screen and bring the opacity of that right down. So to check how this looks, look over here on the left and see if the opacity is working for you. Just a very subtle look there. Make it 3D, hit P, keyframe the position, go to the end of the composition. So I'll just drag here on the 0 numbers. You can see if I drag to the right it moves away from the camera, if I drag to the left it just moves forward a little bit, and that just adds this sense of there being a general fogginess in the whole scene that's spilling over the boat as well. So adding fog is very simple, but this little trick of tilting it away in 3D and then moving it towards the camera makes it so much more realistic. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. In the last lesson we looked at fog, which is a very common request for compositors. You're often required to add fog. Something else you're very often asked to put in is sparks and flashes of light. This is particularly common in disaster scenes, war scenes or science fiction, but I'll show you how to apply this technique to this handheld shot of an electricity pole, and then you can use it on anything you like. So by now you know exactly how to track footage into place. I've chosen a large contrasted area there in the frame rather than something small because there's so much handheld motion. If I pick a tiny contrasty point, every time there's a big blur from the camera motion, the track will fail. So I've just chosen a large black area there and that's tracked nicely. Apply that to our null. Then we'll drag our sparks layer into the timeline and use the parenting lasso to connect it to the null. Now when we play through it moves correctly. I'm going to right click on it, go to blending mode add, then hit A on the sparks layer and use the controls down here to position it. This is all very familiar to you now by this point in the course. However, you'll notice there are a few problems here. We've tracked it in perfectly, but to me those sparks just look a little too large. Let's imagine you've rendered these separately or bought this element from a stock footage supplier. If you think they're too large, well, you'd say, okay, we'll just scale them down. Hit S, scale that down. We'll have to re-anchor them into place. So we'll move the anchor points again, and all's well, except you'll notice that the sparks are cutting off at the edge here. So I change the blending mode to normal. That's the whole size of the frame. So we need to blend those out a little as they approach the edge of their natural frame. To make this easier, I will make them slightly larger. I'll scale that up to about 54%, then reposition with the anchor points. I'm also going to change the blending mode. I find that given this is a dull day, the add blending mode is just a bit too much. Screen works better. They now look quite good. So I'll go to a point where there are plenty of sparks visible around there, and now I need to draw a mask. So I'll just draw the mask around the bottom edge here. So this is the area where we're aiming to mask, and then we choose the mask feather tool. Click at the bottom of the mask here and drag inside like that, and you can see that gives us a long, subtle area where everything blends out pleasantly. And we don't need them to blend out at the side, so just grab the dotted line there and drag it out to the edge on that side and drag it out to the edge on that side. It's worth checking through to see if the mask gets in the way of any sparks that fly up, but I don't think that's a problem here. If I check through at full speed, that does appear to work very well. Ideally, you would want an element that was large enough that you could allow the sparks to drop off at the bottom of the screen, but if that's not the case, this is a good solution. Now you'll notice that as we go through, there are a couple of moments. One there at the half-second point where the sparks suddenly burst out. It happens again a little further on there at the 2-second mark. So at those points, we really need to indicate what's going on with a flash of light. And we should probably have one right at the beginning as well, because that's when the sparks appear. You never get sparks just dropping out of something, there's always a little flash. So to do that, we'll go to New Solid, create a black solid, then choose the brush tool. Choose a nice large brush over here, say a 300, and then with that, double click on the layer to open it in the layer window, and then just click a few times to create a nice blob of light. Go back to composition, we'll right click on this and change its blending mode to screen. You might want to use add, it depends on the circumstances, but we'll use that for now. Again, parent this black solid to the null, then hit A to position it over the place where the sparks will appear. And when I look at that, I think I'm going to prefer to use the add blending mode. It's generally the best one for flashes and brightness. It's just way too bright there. So let's hit T and say its maximum brightness is going to be about no more than that. That's at 40%. You might want to just go a little brighter for odd moments, but I think that look there around 40 is just right. So we'll start off at the very beginning of the timeline here with this set to 0. Keyframe the opacity, then move forward just one frame by clicking next frame. At that point we can flicker this up a little, so we'll push it up to 26, go forward one more frame and push it right up to its maximum, which for us is around 40 or so. Move forward another frame and take it right down, not completely to 0, but to about 15. And this is keyframing every time, of course, that we make a change. Now move forward a couple of frames and take it down to 0. When you play through that, you'll see you just get a very brief flash like that. Now if you're not happy with it, it's easy to adjust this by just moving the keyframes. You can pull them around like this and vary the length of time for each part of the flash and get exactly what you want that way. In fact, looking at that now, I'm thinking we might want to go brighter at the maximum point. So I'm just going to change the opacity up to about 60, and in fact I think the scale needs to go up, so I'll hit S, just scale that up, hit A to reposition it with the anchor points, and that's looking more like it. When we play through that now, we get that real feeling of a flickering flash of light. I'm going to pull the keyframes back a bit closer because I do prefer it to flicker rather than pulse. And a simple tip for improving this is to just duplicate the layer and then move it forward just a few frames, and then you've got two copies flickering one after the other.
And then you just repeat that process each time the sparks are about to explode like they are doing there. Put in another layer with more of these flickers. I'm going to switch on motion blur for the sparks, and this does make them quite indistinct in fact, but that matches the motion blur of the camera. So this is a fairly easy compositing job. You just have to remember to use this variable mask feather if your element isn't the right size, and then create some good flickering light to really sell the shot. And of course make sure you have a good sound designer, because anything with sparks works so much better when you have that little spark sound behind it. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. I'm really excited about this lesson because if you look at how handheld and shaky this footage is, it looks absolutely impossible in terms of a compositing job. How could you ever track this and get something to stay in place? Although there are parts of the image that stay relatively stable, such as the top of this mountain, if you watch it through the whole shot, it has objects passing in front of it, and there's just so much motion here that tracking this is close to impossible. So, in fact, we don't track it. We use the Warp Stabilizer VFX. I'm just going to drag that onto the clip and let it do its analysis. For this particular clip, I don't find I need to do the detailed analysis. So the analysis comes to an end and then it stabilizes. Under Advanced, we switch the objective to Reversible Stabilization. And once that's stabilized, we're able to watch this, and you can see that the mountain, if you just look at that mountain and try and ignore the edges, that mountain stays in exactly the same place all the way through. And that means we're going to be able to composite something into the sky without any problems at all. However, if you look at the very early part of the shot, there is a bit of ripple and wobble around there, and that's possibly because the warp stabilizer is tracking these foreground elements. So let's get rid of them. Down here I'm going to click on Show Track Points, and then I'm going to turn up the track point size so that they become really visible. Make sure that Auto Delete Points Across Time is checked, and then all we're doing is looking for these areas that have been tracked in the foreground. Drag the mouse around them and delete. Everything back here is fine, so I'll move forward a few frames. You can see there's more foreground material. We'll just collect all that, delete it, and this just means that the warp stabilizer won't attempt to stabilize these parts of the frame, which should make the background look more stable. Get that there. You don't have to get every point. I like to, just to make sure you get an absolutely perfect track, but the truth is After Effects does a very good job of estimating what you're trying to track. So if you go in and just get a few of these foreground points, it'll know not to get the rest of them. However, just to be on the safe side, I will get all these. Just be careful not to get the ones in the background. This mountain is the main thing that we're tracking, so I accidentally got that point there, and I've just deselected it to make sure I don't delete it. From here on in, the track looked pretty good, so I'm not going to go through the whole shot deleting the foreground because it seemed to cope very well after the first couple of seconds. So I'll just stop around here, go back to the beginning, make sure you turn Show Track Points off, and now you can watch through and see what sort of a job it's done. And now some of that wobble has been removed. It's looking more stable right from the outset. So this means we can drop something into the frame and it'll look stable because it'll be stable in relation to that background. So I'll go to a point around here and drag the UFO TIFF in and just hit R and rotate that so that it looks to be on the same plane. Hit S, shrink it down. We can do some color correction and blurring later on, but for now we're just seeing how that looks, if it looks as though it's stable in the frame. Don't worry about the fact that it's going in front of the trees, we'll sort that out in a minute. And that does look absolutely stable at this point. Okay, we need to get it behind those trees, and to do that we'll just do a bit of keying. So I'm going to duplicate the car window layer. Make sure you don't drag a fresh one in, you want to copy the one that's had all the warp stabilizer work done. Edit, duplicate, and drag the second one up
I'll rename that keying layer, and then I'll apply key light. The idea here is to key out everything except the green foreground. So I'll just select the blue, and that looks as though it'll get rid of nearly everything except the green. And you can see already the UFO is showing through the trees there. To be clear on what I'm doing though while I'm working, I'm going to make the lower layer invisible. Now reselect the keying layer, and I'm going to change final result here in the view to screen matte, so I can really see what I'm doing. Then under the screen matte settings, I want to clip the black until most of that sky disappears, and then I want to drag the clip white back until all these hazy grey areas down here disappear and become fully white. Just drag that back. You have to be careful, because if you go too far, suddenly the mask inverts. So just before that point, stop. Then change screen matte back to final result. There we have a good key on this tree in the foreground. We do need to soften it though, so just under screen softness, I'm going to turn that up to feather those edges. That should be ideal. We don't have to do a perfect key here because everything's moving fast, and some blurring is absolutely fine. However, we may get errors creeping in, like up here there's a bit of sky creeping through and so on. There's no point in keying the whole image. We're only interested in this area around the UFO in the background. So I'm just going to get the rectangle tool and drag out a mask over that area. And you can see that because the layer has been warped, it's drawing it at a slightly different place to where I've drawn it. So all we do is hit V, drag that mask over, and now it's over the UFO. I'm going to hit F to feather it. Now when I turn the lower layer back on, you can see that that UFO is showing up through the tree, and as we go over here, as the next tree appears, and the UFO should pass behind it. There we go. And that makes the whole shot much more realistic. See, if I look there, it's working up until that point, but I'm not particularly happy with it there. So I'll just turn off the background, and I think what needs to happen here is just click on the right of the mask, drag that out that way. So you may need to keyframe the mask shape. I'm going to do that here. Hit M, keyframe the mask path, and just keep an eye on that. Make sure that we get the areas of the image that we need at any particular time. Turn the background back on. However, I did spot back here, just around there, you can see part of the sky has been keyed in accidentally there. So at this point, I'm going to want to draw the mask down. So I'll just pull that down, 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 till that part of the sky vanishes. And now that's corrected, that's fine. So you'll need to check through all the way to make sure this works, but overall, I think we've got a good result there. When you've done all the work that you need to do in here, you're going to need to pre-compose these, but before you do, and this is a really important step, go to the car window clip, click on the warp stabilizer VFX, then go to edit and copy. Now shift click to select all three layers, go to layer, pre-compose, hit OK. Now go to edit, paste. And you can see the warp stabilizer VFX has been added again. Now under the advanced settings, go to objective and change reversible stabilization to reverse stabilization. Now when you watch this back, you can see the handheld look has returned, but the UFO is stationary in that shot. If I do want to make changes, I can just double click this layer, go in, and I can maybe reduce the opacity of the UFO, like that, just to blend it in, maybe do some color correction, probably add a Gaussian blur. So now when we watch it back, that shot is working extremely well. There, everything looks like it's in the right place. The UFO is hovering over the mountains in the background, passes behind the tree. The only problem we have is this black space around the frame. The amazing thing about the warp stabilizer is that you can now solve this simply by dropping a copy of the original clip below the pre-comp. When I do that, you can see the space is filled out, and we now have a stable UFO flying over the mountains in an incredibly wobbly handheld shot. Now, if there's any point where it's not working quite as well as you like, you can just add extra camera shake to cover it. I think for this version it's working fine and you don't need it, but if you do need that, just pre-compose these layers, hit S, scale them up a little, then go to Window, Motion Sketch, go to the beginning of the clip, press Start Capture, and then just drag around in the middle of the frame like this, and this adds some artificial handheld wobble. Then turn on Motion Blur and Motion Blur Visibility, and then when you watch that back, the extra shake that has been put in will cover any slight tracking errors. So if your track was not perfect, if it's not perfectly stabilized, that's a way to cover it up. So when you get shots where there's a lot of foreground motion or a lot of unwanted background motion, this is an excellent way to track something into the background. It doesn't have to be something in the sky, it could be against a wall, a building, any other object. This is a technique you will use all the time. There are a few steps that seem a little counterintuitive, but once you get used to this, it is one of the most powerful ways to composite. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass, in which I'm going to show you how to create this sort of effect where as the head turns we see through the skin and see the flesh and bones beneath. And the idea is this looks almost 3D. You can see there from the front we're looking on at the bones and flesh just becoming visible, and then as the head turns they become completely visible and you see right through. As you can imagine, we'll do this by tracking in Mocha AE, but it's a little more advanced than what we've done before. So go to Animation, Track in Mocha AE, just click OK. You want to play through this until you find an area where the face is really side on, because we're going to want to be putting the image over this jawbone, so there's no point in trying to start tracking it here. It's quite difficult for Mocha to see that shape, whereas if we go right to the end, over here, that shape is very clearly defined and it's going to be easier for it to track backwards. So whatever you're tracking, always look for the place where it's easiest to draw a good outline of it. So select the X-Spline tool here, and then rather than selecting the whole head, I find it usually works best if you select an area that represents the plane but captures where the contours are as well. So rather than just going, this is the side of the head, I think it's better to say, let's click around the top of the cheekbone there, down towards the mouth, across the line of the chin and down to the jawbone. Then rather than coming down here and capturing the neck, we want to follow this plane of the jawbone. So click there, up here, up to the ear, and then follow the hairline, and then right click. We have our plane. We now click Track Backwards and watch to see how good a job that does. And you see it's coping perfectly at this point because there's been no rotation, but I'm hovering over the stop button here. I'm just going to stop there, see how that's going. That is looking okay. I'll keep tracking backwards. And that looks fine to me. This one here just might want to be pulled out a little, but there's no point in doing it here at the end. I need to go back to a place where that seemed to start going off, perhaps there. As I grab the point here, you'll notice it shows up on the top left over here. So I can just grab that, check that that crosshair is absolutely on the edge of the jawline there. Now track backwards from there, and that now remains accurate all the way to the end. We now have a really good plane of the face. In previous lessons you've seen me go up here, select layer 2 and right click and choose Align Selected Surfaces. And we're going to do that again, but it is absolutely vital where you do this in the timeline. If you leave the current time indicator here and align it to this, you'll get very poor results. The final image we've created is a side-on view of a skeleton. So it needs to be aligned when her face is side on. Whatever artwork you create has to be made in a way that will align with the surface at some point. In this case, it aligns here. So we could pick a point around here or somewhere at the end. Anywhere will do, so long as it's not here where her face is side on. So I'll probably pick one of the earlier places where it's aligned, around there, and now I'll go up to layer 2, align selected surfaces, go to export tracking data, choose After Effects corner pin, supports motion blur, copy to clipboard, then go back to After Effects. So you could bring in an image like this and work with that, mask it into place and so on. What I've done in this particular case, however, was export this exact frame to Photoshop, and then in Photoshop I've painted on the elements that I want, and then I've brought that whole image, including the actor and the skeleton, into After Effects. I found that's just a good way to help line things up. So I'll drop this into the timeline, and I'll do some masking immediately so we can watch this properly. I'll click on the pen tool. I'm going to go underneath the eye there and just draw a very basic mask. Click around. I'll hit F, feather that a little. Now, very important to take the current time indicator back to the beginning of the clip, and now go to Edit and Paste. And you can see there a lot of the work is already done. Our surface is aligned at this point, and from the front that looks quite 3D. The anchor points may need moving. It's not exactly aligned the way I want, so I'll hit A, and I'll use these anchor points to just move that into position. I prefer that. Now I'm going to work on the masking a little. Just hit V and pull these control points until I get exactly what I want down here. I want some sense of this bone showing through, but not so much that it's obliterating the eye there. And at the front here I might pull these back because I want to still be able to see her lips, and it's as though the teeth are just showing through like an X-ray. Perhaps pull this in at the side. There. So I'm quite happy with the way that looks there. I'll just hit M and keyframe the mask path in case I want to change that. And you can see one of the things that makes this work is just these subtle movements in this second half of the shot are matched exactly. And it's those tiny movements that make compositing so effective. It really looks as though that has been painted onto her. And when you come around to the front, of course, it doesn't look quite as good, which is why we need to bring the opacity up gradually. The idea of the shot is that we see through her skin better as she turns, but also that is used to cover for the fact that here it looks a little bit stuck on. So around this point here it's still looking okay, but around here not so good. So I'm going to hit T, bring the opacity right down, and in fact I'll probably want to mask out this neck bone here because I don't like the way that's looking. So I'll just pull the mask up to obliterate that because it's showing through her hair there. And I'll keyframe the opacity. If I hit M, you can see a keyframe has appeared for the mask, of course, because that's a change. Now I'll just play through, and that looks quite good without any changes. Actually, I really quite like the opacity the way it is. I definitely want to cycle through the blending modes to see what might look better or more interesting. It depends what sort of look you're going for. Here there's a sort of glowing effect, or you can get something more colourful or more like an X-ray. That one's good as well. But when you make these changes, of course, you will have to go back and see if the opacity you used works. Here it doesn't, so I'll bring the opacity down a little. And this blending mode is hard light, and that works well because it shows the bones and the colour of the flesh coming through as well. Always worth experimenting with different blending modes to see what works best for your individual shot. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. You can see here we shot this with the car not moving and the window open. The reason for that is that it makes more sense to composite a window in and then add some motion to create the sensation of the car moving than to try and get rid of the reflections that are in the window. Lighting somebody inside a car is extremely difficult, and lighting them without getting reflections on the glass is just about impossible. So most of the time it's best to take the windows out where you can. However you shoot, you'll be minimizing the reflections, and then you need to add some in to create this sensation of motion. In another lesson, we use this clip to show how you can use the warp stabilizer. I also use the warp stabilizer to get this as stationary as I could. This is not a perfect stabilization. If you look at the right of the frame there, it's breaking up and going black, and then towards the end the synthesis just isn't really working very well. But it's a vaguely stable shot out of a car window, and that's exactly what we need here. It doesn't have to be perfect. So I'll go to the beginning of the clip, drop view stable in, and now hit T and bring the opacity down. And you can see there that it's not on quite the right angle. We need to make it 3D, and then I'm going to hit W to bring up the rotation tool, hover over the green Y arrow, and then just turn this around like that. It needs to be along the same plane as the window would be. I'll hover over the X as well. And then I think we just need to scale this up. So I'll hit S, rescale that, then hit V, hover over the X axis and move it this way. We want to make sure that it's going to be covering the whole of the window space. We need to mask it out, so I'll select the pen tool, and then around this top edge here you want to draw a very accurate and sharp mask, because this is where the glass would be disappearing into the window frame. Then we'll just click around here, and down at this edge it's a little different. Rather than going for the exact edge, I'll just zoom in, you don't want to come to this higher edge here. The glass would actually be emerging along this black line. So you draw your mask along there. Then you continue along underneath, go around the side and complete the mask. The mask isn't absolutely perfect here, so I'm just going to bring that up again. I don't really want to feather it because that will make it look soft where it needs to be hard. So instead I'll go in and adjust. If need be, I'll add more mask points. So around here, I think one more mask point would help. Just get that exact shape. There, that's looking good now. And you can see down here it really does look as though there's glass in front of this inner part of the window. I'm going to hit T again and bring this right down, because again, when you are shooting somebody in a car on the back of a trailer, you don't let the reflections look like this. You bring them down as far as you can. You do everything you can to mask out the reflections. So we don't want to artificially add reflections like there would be in the real world. We want to make it look like a feature film. So I think about 30% is good. We also want to blur it. A Gaussian blur will add an overall feeling of this being slightly out of focus, but I also like to add a directional blur, which just emphasizes the motion. So turn this dial across like that, so it's pointing in the direction of travel, and then turn the blur length up. That will work, but now we need to add some motion. So I'm going to select the two layers and go to Layer, Pre-Compose, click OK, and now hit P, then click on the word Position. Then you need to hit Option on a Mac, Alt on Windows, hold that down at the same time as Shift and equals. Then you get this appearing down here, and we type in there the word wiggle, then parentheses, and 5, 10. And that just means that it's going to wiggle 5 times a second by 10 pixels. And just click off. Now when we play back, you can see a realistic motion has been added. Of course, there are black edges appearing, very small black edges, so we just need to hit S and scale that up to about 104%, and that should compensate for any motion. And that looks now like a well-stabilized shot, but with some motion, as though they really are driving along the road. To perfect this, you might want to add some reflections to this little bit of window showing here, and maybe anything out the back over here. But for most cases, this would do the trick. Hello, this is Chris Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. Looking at this clip here, let's imagine we want something to fly out of our hand, some sort of glowing plasma ball. We can't do the usual tracking with Mocha because it's not a surface or a plane there, and we can't really track that with the normal tracker because our hand goes off screen. So the technique I'm going to show you here is where we manually animate. And believe it or not, this is actually a shortcut. One of the things you're always looking to do is find a quicker way to work, and sometimes manually animating something into place is the best way. So I'm going to take the glow ball layer here and drop it in, change its blending mode to add, and then I'll find somewhere in the middle of the scene, around about here, where I can attach it. So I'll just hit P to bring up the keyframe position and just drag it into place. Let's say it's in her hand there, and keyframe the position. Now the reason I picked that midpoint there is that if I'd tried somewhere down here, it's a bit more difficult to see because it's against the white, and if I'd gone back over here, that's where there's too much motion happening. So around in the middle is where there's just a good pause and a good place where we can see it. However, if you look at the edge here, you can see that the glow of the ball is bleeding right to the edge of the frame, and we can actually see the edge of the frame there. So let's sort that out now before we go any further. Get the ellipse tool, make sure we've got the layer selected, and just draw an ellipse around that shape. Hit F, feather that slightly, and now that problem's solved. Just hit P again to bring up our keyframe so we can see what we're doing, and go back up to 100%. So if I play this through, you can see a hand moves forward, then it moves down. So at around this point here is where I would attempt to reposition. So I'll just manually reposition that, and now I'll play through, see if it matches up. It's not exact, but all I have to do is go to the halfway point here and put it back into place. Now this might seem time consuming, but in actual fact you can cover a lot of ground very quickly. You look, we've already done that. Just go back a little further, drop that into place, down to here. Okay, and if I play that through, it looks like it's in her hand. Might want to move that up as though it's in her fingers there, rather than in the palm of her hand. Now at this point it gets a little more interesting because her hand goes out of frame, and so you're guessing to some extent. But if we just look 3 frames down there, it's only moved slightly away. And then we go back a few more frames, and it's just guesswork here. You're just moving it around according to what you're seeing on screen. If you play that back, you can see that looks absolutely fine. There are no rules here. You just look at how it appears on screen and you should get a result you're happy with. So if I play that back now, we can see the glow before it comes into frame. It's worth moving it around a little bit in this opening section, even if it doesn't track exactly to a hand, so that it just looks as though that sphere is moving down there. Then it comes out. We've got to our original position now. So without tracking, we've covered half the shot already. I'll move forward a few frames, take it back to here, a few more frames, and you see this is where her hand actually pauses, so we need to be a bit more accurate here. So I'll go back to the point where her hand stops moving, which is there, move it into place, but rather than leaving it stationary, we'll go forward 1 frame, and although our hand hardly moves, we'll just jiggle it a little. Then we'll go forward again by 1 frame, and now move it down. And at this point it's worth animating frame by frame, and you're not looking for accuracy, you're just adding some motion here. Now she's started to move forward, so we'll match that, but then we can go forward a couple of frames to there, couple more frames to there, and there we go. We've pretty much got to the end of the animation. Now here it's supposedly going to shoot off from her hand, so I'll go forward a few frames and pull it right off the screen. And you can see the slight wobble that we gave it around that area just really adds to that sensation of it having been tracked in, even though it wasn't tracked in. Looking at that point there, we perhaps need to add another keyframe, just drag it back to our hand. The rest of it I'm happy with. Probably want to switch blurring on for this layer. So that's a very simple way to animate something in manually, and don't always assume you have to track. A lot of the time this is going to be quicker and will actually give you a better result. I'm not so happy with that feather though, it's looking a bit too hard as well. I'm just going to expand that feather and that works better. I do need to add another mask as well, because you can see here the light is coming in front of her head, and although that's not too bad, you just get a much stronger feeling if you let some of the light go behind her head. So at this point here, I'm going to click the pen tool and just draw another mask around her head and hair. Don't have to go all the way down, and just come up around the side here. I'm going to change the color of this mask down here, make this one red so we can see it, and then we'll switch that to subtract. Now it looks a bit hard and severe, so I'll just hit F and feather that. And now a little bit of the light is bleeding around the front, but not too much, and you can see if I just switch that off, there's a big difference between when the light's coming in front of her face and when it's going behind. I much prefer that. We do need to animate this mask, however, so I'll just hit M, keyframe the path, and just make sure that all the way through that mask is going to be sitting over her hair. If I go back to here, I can line the mask up, and that's probably the last time I'll need to do it, because in fact the light is nowhere near her head at that point. So I'll just line it up there. You may find that putting all the light behind her head is a bit too much, so sometimes I like to just duplicate the layer, hit M, and invert the second mask down here so that that light's again going in front of her. Then just hit T and pull the opacity down, and that means we've got a little bit of light going in front, but not too much. This is what compositing is all about, finding these subtle effects that just make a difference, help sell the shot. So rather than looking like a lens flare that was stuck on, it should look like something that was in the scene and is going behind her head and yet giving off a glow. You could take this even further and add some glow to the walls if you wanted and mask that out, but I think for a shot like this, simple is best because it's all over in just a second or two. Hello, this is Christopher Kenworthy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. We're going to have a look at putting in a heads-up display in front of the actor here. You'd have seen this in many films such as Minority Report and just about every science fiction film that's come since then. So somebody moves their hands through the air and we see elements of a screen appear like a hologram in front of them. It's a sort of a cross between a hologram and an iPad really. So I've created an image in Photoshop with several different layers, and the key to getting this right is how you import that. So I'll go to File, Import, and File, and then here we have the Canvas 1 PSD, and you have these options down here to import as footage, composition, or composition retain layer sizes. Choose composition. If you do anything else, this won't work. So with composition chosen, don't check Photoshop sequence, just go to Open. You'll then get this box. Make sure that Editable Layer Styles is chosen here, then click OK. You can see here that we've got the Canvas 1 composition. If I click that open, there it is. But we don't want to use that, we want to drag the files in as one. So I've opened the Canvas 1 Layers folder, I'm going to shift click to select them all, and then just drag these down to the timeline. Now I can work on these as one because I've got them all selected. So I'll hit the 3D box, make them all 3D. Then I'm going to hit W to bring up the rotation tool. And because you can see there on the left the numbers are facing us, we need to turn this around so that they're facing her. So there, the screen's now sort of on a plane that she would be looking at. I'm going to hit V, hover over the X and just move that across a little. Then I'll hit S, drag this down to scale this down for all the layers. Now this is far too bright of course, so I'll also hit T, bring the opacity down, and then we'll try a different blending mode. I'll right click on just one of these layers, choose blending mode screen, and they all change to screen. So although you're working with a lot of layers here, you can work on them all at once just by keeping them selected. And the beautiful thing is you can grab hold of any individual layer in here and move it around independently of the others, as you can see there. Select all these layers and make them all invisible. Then I'm going to play through until the point where she's just about to pull that down. So the screen will come into frame about here. So we'll just go back to here. At that point I'll hit P and click one keyframe position clock, and to make all the layers visible. And at this point I will now hover over the Y
and drag these up until they're just out of frame. Pull back a little more to make that easier. There we go. Now I'll move forward a couple of frames, and here it should be following the line of her hand, so I'll just drag that down. Then I'll move forward a few more frames and bring it down to here. So if you watch that animate in, you can see it comes in as she pulls it down. I think that those first keyframes move a little too fast, so I'll just select them all by dragging around them like that, and then I'm just going to move them to the left. And then we'll play through and see if that works better. It's still not quite low enough, so I'll move forward another couple of frames. Make sure I've shift clicked all the layers, apart from the operation room layer of course, and then just drag this down into place. Now I like to give this a feeling of it bouncing as it gets into place. If you look at the moment, she just drags it in and it stops. But it's a little nicer if you give it this slight sensation of motion. So I'll move forward a couple of frames, and then again making sure everything is selected. I'm just going to move that up a little, move forward another 2 or 3 frames, and move it down a little. And that should just create this slight wobble as it gets into place. And you can see it pulls in and just has a little bounce. I like to turn on blurring at this point and blurring visibility, and then you can see how that's going to look. That's much better. I also like to add a slight wobble to everything here. So I'm going to create a new null object, hit A to bring up its anchor point, and then hit Alt on Windows, Option on Mac, along with Shift and equals. And then in here I type wiggle, and in the parentheses I put 2 and 4, and that means that it'll wobble by 4 pixels 2 times a second. And now I select all the layers again, grab the parenting lasso for just one, and drag that up to the null. And now I'll switch blurring off because it's slowing down rendering, and if we watch that you can see that after this moves in and stops, there's now just a very subtle motion. It's as though this is sort of electrified or being projected. You can increase the amount of that wiggle if you like, but I find that looks okay. Let's just check through to where her finger goes to see if it's in the right place for that image on the top left. That's not quite right. So we perhaps need to rescale these images just to compensate for that. Rather than repositioning them, I think scale will do the trick. So I'll hit S, just drag the scale up slightly, and there we go. Having done that, I do just want to check that this all matches up still, and that looks fine. So her face is quite hidden at this point, so after she chooses one image and brings it to the center, I want nearly everything to disappear. So we'll go up to this point here where she's just about to swipe across, and at that point we need to bring this one layer down. So she's swiping about there. If you're never sure which layer you're looking at, you can just click through the eye icons over here and watch what disappears until you find the one that you want. And there, that's the one we want, layer 5. So I'll switch it back on. I'm going to change its color to make it a little easier to spot, and then I'll hit P, and over here hit this keyframe diamond. That adds another keyframe there. Then I'll move forward until the point where she stops moving. It's about there, and then I'll drag that frame down into that position. That's not bad at all. It looks as though there it's a little ahead of what she's doing, so I might just drag this keyframe to the right, and now it looks as though it follows her finger. That's better. You could put another wobble on the end here, so just move one keyframe forward, move it a couple of pixels to the side, move another frame forward, and move it another couple of pixels. And that'll just add this slight wobble as it lands in place there. Now, any second now she's going to do this gesture where she expands it. So at this point we just stop here, and before I do anything else I'm going to get ready to make everything else go transparent. So I'm going to close up layer 5, and I'm just going to drag it higher in the timeline so it's up here. Then I'll shift click all the other layers, hit T, click opacity, and then I'll go forward until the point where her gesture's finished, and I'll drag the opacity right down. That means we'll be able to see her, and the frame that she's picked will have taken over precedence of the scene. I'll go to the place where she begins her gesture, which is about here. I'll hit P, keyframe that, hit S, keyframe that, and hit A and keyframe the anchor point, just in case we need to work with that. Go forward to the point where her gesture's just about finished. Scale that right up to about the size of her hands, but of course it shoots off to the side of the screen there because it's in 3D. So now I'm just going to hit V and drag that back into place. You could be more exacting if you want, but I like the fact that that just sort of captures the feel of her gesture rather than matching her fingers exactly. When she comes to swipe it across, you would just animate it off to the side. Put in another diamond keyframe there, move forward a few frames, hit V and just drag it off. And this sort of effect looks so much better when you turn the motion blurring on, because these things really blur quite heavily as they're moved around the screen. And to composite everything properly, you will need to do some color correction. So if I choose color balance, apply it to this main image, I'll just push up the highlight blue, then I'll add a glow, turn up the glow radius. Now I'll just shift click on these filters over here, go to edit, copy, then shift click on all my other layers and edit, paste. And then the entire canvas is going to glow in a pleasant 3D hologram way. When there are fast motions such as this, it's often better to use manual tracking rather than trying to use the built-in tracker, and this gives you much more room for experimentation. And when you're working with Photoshop layers like this, you really can create very strong images in just a few minutes. Hello, this is Christopher Kennedy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. We're going to be turning this very ordinary shot into something much more interesting. Here we have the actor walking down a suburban street and we want it to look as though she's in a more urban area. So we're going to put her in a city. Here she's in a little suburb in Perth, Australia, and we're going to put her in Vancouver. We do this through set extension, which is a case of adding background elements that look 3D. All we're using are these still images, but by placing them into the scene as 3D layers, it will look as though they are actually part of the scene. So you can transform a really ordinary shot like this into something much more impressive without ever having to use a green screen. You can shoot wherever you want and end up with the scene being in whatever city you want. One thing you will notice, however, this was shot with a very short lens. You can see how the lines here converge very sharply. If it's shot with a longer lens, you don't have such strong convergence, and it's important that the photographs you use have a similar convergence. So you can see here again very sharp lines on that bridge there. For this one will be in the flat background, so it doesn't matter, and the same here, this one will be turned on its side, so it doesn't matter. But if you actually have perspective, make sure the perspective matches that of your shot as closely as possible. So begin by tracking in 3D. I've done that already to save time, and I also did a detailed analysis. As you can see, this shot doesn't have much detail, so even if I turn the track point size up, there's not many tracking points over in the background. There are a few over here, but mostly they're up the front here. There are some back here. So we'll take one that's as far back as possible. If we take a tracking point that's really near the front of the camera, then everything will be attached to that point and we might get too much of the camera's motion. Ideally, something around here would work, because that way we're attaching it to what looks to be the visual middle of the scene. So we need something that represents the flat plane here. So I'm going to choose a tracking point over here, as far away from the camera as I can, and we'll create a null and camera. Now we'll drag the bridge JPEG in and make it 3D. At this point we've got a 3D frame moving very close to the camera, and you can see there, watching its outline, that it is matching the motion of the camera,
but it's not in the right place for anything to look right at all. So first of all, I'll just make it invisible, and I want this bridge to actually run along this side of the road. So first of all, it needs to be switched around. So I'll hit W to bring up the rotation tool, hover over the Y green arrow, and just turn it around like that in 3D space. Now I need to move it away from the camera, so I'm going to go to 2 views horizontal, and then I'm going to get hold of it here and just physically drag it away from the camera. So you can see the camera here, and I'm just moving that layer away and then off to the side. Now if we go back to 1 view, you can see that already that's looking a little better. It moves with the camera's motion and it's almost in the right place. Now to do the rest of this work, it's best to turn the opacity down. So I hit T, drag the opacity down, and then I can see these 2 lines here, the line of the bridge and the line of the curb that I'm trying to get in line with each other. And if I hover over the Z-axis and turn like that, you can see I've got those lines in line with each other, but the bridge is now leaning away from the camera way too much. So if I hover over the X and pull down, I get it to stand up again. So I'm looking now at this column here. It's okay if the columns in the distance lean, because that's the effect of the lens curvature, but I really want this one that's close to camera to lean as little as possible. So maybe out a little like that would be fine. If you look at this building in the background over here, that's also leaning out. Now I'll hit V and use that Z tool just to push that out to there. I'm going to go back to 2 views just to give me a little more control over how this moves in 3D space. I'll grab this here, and I need it to come right to the edge of the screen there. So I'm going to move it across like that. And I think what's become obvious now is I need to scale it up. It's not large enough to make the distance all the way down. So there are no hard and fast rules to how you do this. It's not as though I can say, type in this particular setting and you'll get the result. It is a case of looking and moving the images around until you get what you want. So now that I've lined that up, I can see it's not the right size. I'll just scale it up. And now that it's rescaled, I can begin to work with its rotation again and try putting it in place. That's looking a lot better there. Now I'll go back to 1 view. Okay, let's turn the opacity up again and see how that's looking. That looks quite interesting. We'll now do some masking. So rather than doing the masking in this window, we'll look at where the mask needs to be drawn and double click it and do the masking in the layer window. So I click the pen tool, and I think I want to keep all this curbing here, so I'll just click along this edge. I may want some of this tree area down here, but I'm not sure yet, so I'll just capture it anyway. And then all up the length of the bridge, right to the top of the image, cross, and back down. Now I go back to the composition. That's looking quite accurate, very close to what we want. Now I'm looking at the background here and seeing some of this showing through the electricity pole. I think I want to make the bridge bigger to conceal some of that and move it away from the camera in 3D space. So I'll take that back over there, raise it up a little. Now if we look at the vanishing point here, it's the point where the lines are all converging to, is around about here. That's not the same as where the lines are converging in this scene. That's higher up. So I do need to raise the image a little to about there. But when I do that, these curves are no longer matching. So I need to move it back towards the camera and rotate it towards the camera. Now we're getting much closer. So you can see how this is an inexact science that requires a lot of experimentation and quite fiddly work, but as you get closer you begin to see what's really going to work for your particular shot. So I can now tell that the bridge is looking really good, but I don't like the tree up there necessarily, not just because it's blocking her head off, that's okay. Let's just pull these mask points back. I think we'll keep some of the original background there and just pull these mask points down. I'm now quite happy with that. Apart from color correcting it, that looks it to be in the right place. So it's really important to check the motion towards the end of the shot, because this is where there's the most camera movement. So if you look here, that appears to be moving realistically. I'm going to hit F to feather that mask. In the next lesson I'll show you how to add more background elements and another element on this side to really fill this out completely. Hello, this is Christopher Kenworthy and welcome to the Compositing Masterclass. This is part 2 of the set extension lesson, where we've already put in this bridge on the right. Originally we had this suburban street, now we've put in this bridge from Vancouver. That's a bridge that's actually been used in Highlander the series, Smallville and Arrow. It is used in hundreds and hundreds of scenes because it's out the back of the studio, so I thought it would be good to use it in this tutorial. Now we'll put the road JPEG in on the other side of the road. This is the same principle as before, but I'll show you a few small differences. Hit the 3D box, hit W to rotate it in 3D space, and then I'm just going to pick that up and move it off to the side, and now bring its opacity down. So I'm trying to align the two curb lines here, and of course they're a long way off at this point, so I'll do some more rotation. That looks quite good. You can see if I drag on this axis here, it actually slides back in 3D space, which is where I want it to go. But now I will need to rotate it again, so I go over the Y, rotate that into place, and now we're getting fairly close. Hit S to scale this up, because I think I need it to be larger. Hit V and drag that off into the distance. Hit Z and bring it back across. So if I move it over here, we might get a more realistic look, but it's going to need to go further back in space. So again, I'll bring up the transform properties, move that back, and once again scale it up. This combination of scaling and positioning can give you exactly the look that you want. In fact, I'm going to stretch the image slightly, so I'll just click on this point here and stretch it out along one of its scale axes, and that gives me a much better look there. And drag that off on the x-axis, and it's going to hit that far end. It's going to look like it's really going off into the distance. I'm not going to worry too much about that far end because we will be putting in another background over there, so I'll just leave that for now. Let's make it transparent again, just so we can see what we're lining up with. Having seen that, I think it's probably time to do the masking on this now. So I'll draw along the curb here, then just go around the whole image. I'll hit F, feather that edge. And of course you can see the actor is going behind the image here, but just ignore that for now and just try and see if the basic motion works, and it does. And once again, it's an inexact science, and you can see there are a few problems here. The curb's not matching up exactly over at this end. Compositing all comes together at the very end when you get the shots to match completely. For now it's working on the right hand side, but we'll drop a city into the background, and that'll give us a little more control of where we go next. So we'll drop the city in. I'm going to go make that 3D, then go to 2 views horizontal, and this city just needs to go right back. So I'm going to drag it all the way back there. I can see the end of this image here. I want it to go further than that, so I'll drag it behind there. And now over here I can see visually it's in the wrong place, so I'll lift it up, and then I will hit S and scale it up a little. And when you watch that, that works fairly well already. Now you do have the option to key out this sky and let the city show through on this side by making the city layer larger, but I prefer to just have it over here and perhaps show up through this image over here. First of all though, we need to get rid of its sky. You could do this with keying, or I prefer just to draw a quick mask. So I'll click around the buildings. This really doesn't have to be too exact because we're just trying to get rid of the worst of those clouds because they're different to the clouds in the background of our original image. So a quick click around them will do the job, but a quick mask is better than a perfect one. Hit M and invert that mask, and there we have our buildings. Of course, the trees in the background are showing through, which we don't want, so I'm going to hit S and scale up our city again, and then just position it manually. If you look at this dark area at the bottom, I'm trying to get that to blend with this dark area here. So to make the image make a bit more sense, I'll move the city off to the left so it looks as though the bridge is converging and turning into this area of buildings here. That's better than if it just dives off into greenery like that. Of course, most people will not be looking in great detail. You can get away with a lot in compositing because people don't realize it's a compositing shot. They think that they're looking at someone walking down the street and they're not looking for the problems with the visual effect. It's only if you make a big mistake that they'll notice at all. Now we need to mask off some of this area here. So I'll go into the image and draw a new mask. This around the sky area here. I'll just hit M, change that second mask's color to blue so we can keep track of it. And I will set that mask to subtract. And now you can see the cities showing through that mask there. It's quite difficult to see because it was drawn roughly, but there we go. So I'll now drag these mask points out until I'm seeing the city where I want to see it. That works for me so far. Draw the mask points right out to the edge here. That is close enough. If I click off now and pull back, you can see that that really does appear to be there. The only problem I'm having is these wires up in the sky. So I'll double click the layer again and just draw a quick mask around this part of the sky. And now when we go back, there, that's right. It's okay that we've got some wires showing through here. I don't mind that at all. Now the only problem I can see now, apart from the actor being behind the image, is this little area down here, which if you close in on it, the very end of this just looks like too many square pieces sticking together. So we'll add some masking to that. I'm just going to draw an uneven shape down on the bottom right here. Change this fourth mask to a different color again so we can see it. And again set that to subtract. Hit F to feather it. Once you've got this in the screen, you can move it around like this and see what's going to work for the shot. I think just lengthening that out like that might do everything we need. Given how far off in the distance that is, I quite like that. All I need to do now is soften this bottom edge of the bridge image. Go back to the composition window, change the mask to subtract. I quite like the effect I've got there immediately actually. I might hit F and just feather it a little. And the only thing that I'm noticing is that the convergence is all sort of leaning over to the left. So I might just find our road layer. So I'm going to rotate that in just a tiny little bit like that and move it down. The city itself perhaps needs rotating on the Z-axis just to straighten those buildings up. And there does come a point of diminishing returns where you've done so much work that there's not really much point in doing any more. No one's going to notice the problems that you're worrying about. So at this point I'd say, apart from the actor disappearing behind the images, we're done. But we'll play through, check to see if she does disappear behind them. And in fact she does round about there, about the 5-second mark. We just duplicate the layer we're interested in. So I take this layer here, duplicate it, push it to the top of the whole timeline, and then I'll just cut her out of this frame. Choose the roto brush tool, double click on her, draw a line down the middle of her, hit Alt or Option to just get rid of that bit there, and if we go back to the composition, you can see now she's in front of it. We'd obviously need to do a bit of work with the roto brush to refine that and to propagate it through time, but essentially the shot is done. As an alternative, you could draw a mask around the character and animate that through the shot. You might get better results this way, you might get better results with the roto brush. The truth is, this is a very extreme version of set extension. It's quite rare to use such a wide lens and 2 extensions on either side with something in the background. Usually you just put something like this bridge on, or maybe a building over here. So this is as extreme as it gets, and in many cases you won't need to do any masking at all. But when you look at what we started with, which was just a shot of someone walking down a suburban street, it really is quite incredible how this technique can turn it into something much more elaborate. Hello, this is Christopher Kenworthy, and thanks so much for watching the Compositing Masterclass. I hope you've got a lot out of it. I'm sure you will have noticed that the basic technique is to track something into place in your footage and then find different ways of blending it. What we did in the first lesson is not all that different to what we did in the last. It's just a matter of complexity. Also, you will notice that every single lesson looks at a different type of shot. So part of what you need to take away from this is learning to recognize which technique to use. Some shots will be so easy you can use the techniques from the first lesson. In others, you're going to have to use a more involved technique, and that's part of the skill set that you need to build. You won't always be doing something as complex as set extension, but sometimes you will, and other times you'll be able to complete the work with just a few minutes of tracking and compositing. I hope you get to use these skills very often now, and best of luck with all your work.